Other regions. In the northeastern United States, a hot style of playing ragtime had developed. Notably, James Reed's Europe Symphonic Clef Club Orchestra in New York City, which played a benefit concert at Carnegie Hall in 1912. The Baltimore rag style of U.B. Blake influenced James P. Johnson's development of stride piano playing, in which the right hand plays the melody while the left hand provides the rhythm and bass line. In Ohio and elsewhere in the Midwest, the major influence was ragtime until about 1919. Around 1912, when the four-string banjo and saxophone came in, musicians began to improvise the melody line, but the harmony and rhythm remained unchanged. A contemporary account states that blues could only be heard in jazz in the gut bucket cabarets, which were generally looked down upon the black middle class. The Jazz Age. From 1920 to 1933, prohibition in the United States banned the sale of alcoholic drinks, resulting in illicit speakeasies, which became lively venues of the Jazz Age, hosting popular music, dance songs, novelty songs, and show tunes. Jazz began to get a reputation as immoral, and many members of the older generation saw it as a threat to the old cultural values by promoting the decadent values of the Roaring Twenties. Henry Van Dyke of Princeton University wrote, "It is not music at all. It is merely an irritation of the nerves of hearing, a sensual teasing of the strings of physical passion." The New York Times reported that Siberian villagers used jazz to scare away bears, but the villagers had used pots and pans. Another story claimed that the fatal heart attack of a celebrated conductor was caused by jazz. In 1919, Kid Ory's original Creole jazz band of musicians from New Orleans began playing in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where in 1922 they became the first black jazz band of New Orleans origin to make recordings. During the same year, Bessie Smith made her first recordings. Chicago was developing hot jazz, and King Oliver joined Bill Johnson's. Biggs Bederbecks formed the Volvers in 1924. Despite its southern black origins, there was a larger market for jazzy dance music played by white orchestras. In 1918, Paul Whiteman and his orchestra became a hit in San Francisco. He signed a contract with Victor and became the top band leader of the 1920s, giving hot jazz a wide component, hiring white musicians such as Biggs Bederbeck, Jimmy Dorsey, Tommy Dorsey, Frankie Trumbauer, and Joe Venuti. In 1924, Whiteman commissioned George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which was premiered by his orchestra. Jazz began to be recognized as a notable musical form. Olin Downs reviewed the concert of New York Times, wrote, "This composition shows extraordinary talent as it shows a young composer with aims that go far beyond those of his ilk, struggling with a form of which he is far from being master. In spite of all this, he has expressed himself in a significant and on the whole highly original form. His first theme is no mere dance tune, it is an idea, or several ideas, correlated and combined in varying and contrasting rhythms that immediately intrigue the listener." After Whiteman's band successfully toured Europe, huge hot jazz orchestras in theater pits caught on with other whites, including Fred Waring, Gene Goldkeat, and Nathaniel Skilret. According to Mario Dunkel, Whiteman's success was based on a rhetoric of domestication, according to which he had elevated and rendered valuable and previously short kind of music. Whiteman's success caused blacks to follow suit, including Earl Hines, who opened in the Grand Terrace Cafe in Chicago in 1928, Duke Ellington, who opened at Cotton Club in Harlem in 1972, Lionel Hampton, Fletcher Henderson, Claude Hopkins, and Don Reedman, with Henderson and Reedman developing the talking to one another formula for hot swing music. In 1924, Louis Armstrong joined the Fletcher Henderson dance band for a year as featured soloist. The original New Orleans style was polyphonic, with themed variation and simultaneous collective improvisation. Armstrong was a master of his hometown style, but by the time he joined Henderson's band, he was already a trailblazer in a new phase of jazz, with its emphasis on arrangements and soloists. Armstrong's solos went well beyond the theme improvisation concept and extemporized on chords rather than melodies. According to Schuller, by comparison, the solos by Armstrong's bandmates, including a young Coleman Hawkins, sounded stiff stodgy, with jerky rhythms and a gray, undistinguished tone quality. The following example shows a short excerpt of the straight melody of Mandy, Make Up Your Mind by George W. Mayers and Arthur Johnson, compared with Armstrong's solo improvisation. Armstrong's solos were a significant factor in making jazz a true 20th century language. After leaving Henderson Group, Armstrong formed his Hot Five band where he popularized scat singing. Swing in the 1920s and 1930s. The 1930s belonged to popular swing big bands, in which some virtuoso soloists became as famous as the band leaders. Key figures in developing the big jazz band included band leaders and arrangers Count Basie, Cap Calloway, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Fletcher Henderson, Earl Hines, Harry James, Jimmy Lunsford, Glenn Miller, and Artie Shaw. Although it was a collective sound, swing also offered individual musicians a chance to solo and improvise melodic, thematic solos, which could at times be complex, important music. Over time, social structures regarding racial segregation began to relax in America. White band leaders began to recruit black musicians and black band leaders white ones. In the mid-1930s, Benny Goodman hired pianist Teddy Wilson, vibraphonist Lionel Hampton, and guitarist Charlie Christian to join small groups. In the 1930s, Kansas City jazz, as exemplified by tenor saxophonist Lester Young, marked the transition from big bands to the bebop influence of the 1940s. An early 1940s style known as jumping the blues or jump blues used small combos, up-tempo music, and blues chorus progressions, drawing on boogie woogie from 1930s. The influence of Duke Ellington. While swing was reaching the height of its popularity, Duke Ellington spent the late 1920s and 1930s developing an innovative musical idiom for his orchestra. Abandoning the conventions of swing, he experimented with orchestral sounds, harmony, and musical form with complex compositions that still translated well for popular audiences. Some of his tunes became hits, and his own popularity spanned from the United States to Europe. Ellington called his music American music rather than jazz, and liked to describe those who impressed him as beyond category. This included many musicians from his orchestra, some some of whom are considered among the best jazz in their own right. But it was Ellington who melded them into one of the most popular jazz orchestras in the history of jazz. He often composed for the style and skills of these individuals, such as Gyp Blues for Johnny Hodges, Concerto for Cootie Williams, which later became Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, with Bob Russell's lyrics, and the Moochie for Tricky Sam Nanton and Bobber Miley. He also recorded compositions written by his bandsmen, such as Juan Tisso's Caravan and Perdido, which brought the Spanish tinge to big band jazz. Several members of the orchestra remained with him for several decades. The band reached a creative peak in the early 1940s, when Ellington and a small handpicked group of his composers and arrangers wrote for an orchestra of distinctive voices who displayed tremendous creativity. Beginnings of European jazz. As only a limited number of American jazz records were released in Europe, European jazz traces many of its roots to American artists such as James Reese Europe, Paul Whitman, and Louis Johnson, who visited Europe during and after World War I. It was their live performances which inspired European audiences' interest in jazz, as well as the interest in all things American and therefore exotic, which accompanied the economic and political woes of Europe during that time. The beginnings of a distinct European style of jazz began to emerge in this interwar period. British jazz began with a tour by the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1919. In 1926, Fred Elizalde and his Cambridge undergraduates began broadcasting on the BBC. Thereafter, jazz became an important element in many leading dance orchestras, and jazz instrumentalists became numerous. This style entered full swing in France with the Quintet Dahat Club de France, which began in 1934. Much of this French jazz was a combination of African American jazz and the symphonic style in which French musicians were well trained. In this, it is easy to see the inspiration taken from Paul Whiteman's, since his style was also a fusion of the two. Belgian guitarist Janjo Reinhardt popularized gypsy jazz, a mix of 1930s American swing, French dancehall, musette, and Eastern European folk with a languid, seductive feel. The main instruments were steel stringed guitar, violin, and double bass. Solos passed from one player to another as guitar and bass formed the rhythm section. Some researchers believe Eddie Lang and Joe Venuti pioneered the guitar-violin partnership characteristic of this genre, which was brought to France after they had been heard live or on Oaken Records in the late 1920s. Post-war jazz. The outbreak of World War II marked a turning point for jazz. The swing-era jazz of the previous decade had challenged other popular music as being representative of the nation's culture, with big bands reaching the height of the style's success by the early 1940s. Swing acts and big bands traveled with the U.S. military overseas to Europe, where it also became popular. Stateside, however, the war presented difficulties for the big band format. Conscription shortened the number of musicians available. The military's need for shellac, commonly used for pressing gramophone records, limited record production. A shortage of rubber, also due to the war effort, discouraged bands from touring via road travel, and the demand by the Musicians' Union for a commercial recording ban limited music distribution between 1942 and 1944. Many of the big bands who were deprived of experienced musicians because of the war effort, began to enlist young players who were below the age of for conscription, as well as the case with saxophonist Stan Getz' entry in a band as a teenager. This coincided with a nationwide resurgence in the Dixieland style of pre-swing jazz. Performers such as clarinetist George Lewis, cornetist Bill Davidson, and trombonist Turk Murphy were hailed by conservative jazz critics as more authentic than the big bands. Elsewhere, with the limitations on recording, small groups of young musicians developed a more uptempo, improvisational style of jazz, collaborating and experimenting with new ideas for melodic development, rhythmic language, and harmonic substitution during informal late night jam sessions hosted in small clubs and apartments. Key figures in this development were largely based on New York and including pianist Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, drummers Max Roach and Kenny Clarke, saxophonist Charlie Parker, and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. This musical development became known as bebop. Bebop and subsequent post-war jazz developments featured a wider set of notes played in more complex patterns and at faster tempos than previous jazz. According to Clive James, bebop was the post-war musical development which tried to ensure that jazz would no longer be the spontaneous sound of joy. Students of race relations in America are generally agreed that the exponents of post-war jazz were determined, with good reason, to present themselves as challenging artists rather than tame entertainers. The end of the war marked a revival of the spirit of experimentation and musical pluralism under which it had become conceived, along with the beginning of a decline in the popularity of jazz music in America, according to American academic Michael H. Burchett. With the rise of bebop and the end of the swing era after the war, jazz lost its cachet as pop music. Vocalists of the famous big bands moved on to being marketed and performing as solo pop singers. This included Frank Sinatra, Peggy Lee, Dick Haymes, and Doris Day. All the musicians who still perform their pre-war jazz, such as Armstrong and Ellington, were gradually viewed in the mainstream as passé. Other younger performers, such as singer Big Joe Turner and saxophonist Louis Jordan, who were discouraged by bebop's increasing complexity, pursued more lucrative endeavors in rhythm and blues, jump blues, and eventually rock and roll. Some, including Gillespie, composed intricate yet danceable pieces for bebop musicians in an effort to make them more accessible, but bebop largely remained on the fringes of American audiences' purview. The new direction of post-war jazz drew a wealth of critical acclaim, but it steadily declined in popularity as it developed a reputation as an academic genre that was largely inaccessible to mainstream audiences, Burchett said. The quest to make jazz more relevant to popular audiences while retaining its artistic integrity is a constant and prevalent theme in the history of post-war jazz. Bebop. In the early 1940s, bebop-style performers began to shift jazz from danceable popular music towards a more challenging musician's music. The most influential bebop musicians included saxophonist Charlie Parker, pianist Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie and Clifton Brown, and drummer Max Roach. Divorcing itself from dance music, bebop established itself more as an art form, thus lessening its potential popular and commercial appeal. Composer Gunther Schuller wrote, "In 1943 I heard the great Earl Hines band which had Bird in it and all those other great musicians. They were playing all the flatted fifth chords and all the modern harmonies and substitutions, and Dizzy Gillespie runs in the trumpet section work. 2 years later, I read that was bop and the beginning of modern jazz, but the band never made recordings." Bebop musicians employed several harmonic devices which were not previously typical in jazz, engaging in a more abstracted form of chord-based improvisation. Bebop scales are traditional scales with an added chromatic passing note. Bebop also uses passing chords, substitute chords, and altered chords. New forms of chromaticism and dissonance were introduced into jazz. The dissonant tritone or flattened fifth interval became the most important interval of bebop. Chord progressions for bebop tunes were often taught directly from popular swing era tunes and reused with a new, more complex melody and or reharmonized with more complex chord progressions to form new compositions, a practice which was already well established in earlier jazz, but came to be central to the bebop style. Bebop made use of several relatively common chord progressions, such as blues at bass 1/4/5, but often infused with 2/5 motion, and rhythm changes 1/6/2/5, the course to the 1930s pop standard I Got Rhythm. Late bop also moved towards extended forms that represented a departure from pop and show tunes. Afro-Cuban jazz. The general consensus among musicians and musicologists is that the first original jazz piece to the overtly based enclave was Tanga, 1943, composed by Cuban-born Mario Bauza and recorded by Machito and his Afro-Cubans in New York City. Tanga began as a spontaneous descarga Cuban jam session with jazz solos superimposed on top. This was the birth of Afro-Cuban jazz. The use of clave brought the African timeline, or key pattern, into jazz. Music organized around key patterns convey a two-cell binary structure, which is a complex level of African cross rhythm. Within the context of jazz, however, harmony is the primary referent, not rhythm. The harmonic progression can begin on either side of clave. The harmonic 1 is always understood to be 1. Dizzy Gillespie and Chanso Pozo. Mario Bauza introduced bebop innovator Dizzy Gillespie to Cuban conga drummer and composer Chano Pozo. Gillespie and Pozo's brief collaboration produced some of the most enduring African-Cuban jazz standards. Manteca, 1947, is the first jazz standard to be rhythmically based on clave. According to Gillespie, Pozo composed the layered contrapuntal Guejos African-Cuban ostinatos of the A section and the introduction, while Gillespie wrote the bridge. Gillespie's collaboration with Pozo brought specific African-based rhythms into bebop. While pushing the boundaries of harmonic improvisation, Cubop also drew from African rhythm. Jazz arrangement with a Latin A section and a swung B section, with all choruses swung during solos, became common practice with many Latin tunes of the jazz standard repertoire. This approach can be heard on pre-19 recordings of Manteca, A Night in Tunisia, Tintindio, and on Green Dolphin Street. African cross rhythm. Cuban percussionist Mongo Santamaria first recorded his composition Afro Blue in 1959. Afro Blue was the first jazz standard built upon a typical African 3/2 cross rhythm or hemiola. The piece begins with the bass repeatedly playing 6 cross beats per each measure of 12/8, or 6 cross beats per 4 main beats 6/4. Dixieland Revival. In the late 1940s, there was a revival of Dixieland, harking back to the contraptual New Orleans style. This was driven in large part by record company reissues of jazz classics by the Oliver, Morton, and Armstrong bands of the 1930s. There was two types of musicians involved in the revival. The first group was made up of those who had began their career playing in the traditional style and were returning to it, such as Bob Crosby's Bobcats, Max Kaminsky, Eddie Condon, and Wild Bill Davis. Most of these players were originally Midwesterners, although there were a small number of New Orleans musicians involved. The second group of revivalists consisted of younger musicians such as those in the Lou Waters Band, Conrad Janis, and Ward Campbell and his Firehouse 5 plus 2 jazz band. By the late 1940s, Louis Armstrong's All-Stars band became a leading ensemble. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Dixieland was one of the most commercially popular jazz styles in the US, Europe, and Japan, although critics paid little attention to it. Free jazz. Free jazz and the related form of avant-garde jazz broke through into an open space of free tonality in which meter, beat, and formal symmetry all disappeared. The range of world music from India, Africa, and Arabia were melded into an intense, even religiously ecstatic or orgasmic style of playing. While loosely inspired by bebop, free jazz tunes gave players much more latitude. The loose harmony and tempo was deemed controversial when his approach was first developed. The bassist Charles Mingus is also frequently associated with the avant-garde in jazz, although his composition drew from myriad styles and genres. In June 1965, Coltrane and 10 other musicians recorded Ascension, a 50 and 40-minute long piece without breaks that included adventurous solos by young avant-garde musicians as well as Coltrane. It was controversial primarily for the collective improvisation section that separated the solos. Free jazz in Europe. Free jazz was played in Europe in part because musicians such as Isler Taylor, Steve Lacy, and Eric Dolphy spent extended periods of time there. And European musicians such as Michael Mantler and John Tikai traveled to the US to experience American music firsthand. Since the 1960s, creative centers of jazz in Europe have developed, such as the creative jazz scene in Amsterdam. Following the work of drummer Han Bannick and pianist Misha Ben Gelberg, musicians started to explore by improvising collectively until a form, melody, rhythm, a famous song is found. A jazz critic, Kevin Whitehead, documented the free jazz scene in Amsterdam and some of its main exponents, such as the ICP, the Instant Composers Pool, orchestra in his book New Dutch Swing. Since the 1990s, Keith Jarrett has defended free jazz from criticism. British writer Stuart Nicholson has argued European contemporary jazz has an identity different from American jazz and follows a different trajectory. Latin jazz. Latin jazz is jazz that employs Latin American rhythms and is generally understood to have a more specific meaning than simply jazz from Latin America. A more precise term might be Afro-Latin jazz, as the jazz subgenre typically employs rhythms that either have a direct analog in Africa or exhibit an African rhythm influence beyond what is ordinarily heard in other jazz. The two main categories of Latin jazz are Afro-Cuban jazz and Brazilian jazz. In the 1960s and 1970s, many jazz musicians had only a basic understanding of Cuban and Brazilian music, and jazz compositions which used Cuban or Brazilian elements were often referred to as Latin tunes, with no distinction between a Cuban São Montuno and a Brazilian bossa nova. Even as late as 2000, in Mark Gridley's Jazz Styles, History and Analysis, a bossa nova bass line is referred to as a Latin bass figure. It was not uncommon during the 1960s and 1970s to hear a conga played in a Cuban tambao while the drum set and bass played a Brazilian bossa nova pattern. Afro-Brazilian jazz. Brazilian jazz, such as bossa nova, is derived from samba, with influences from jazz and other 20th century classical and popular music styles. Bossa is generally moderately paced, with melodies sung in Portuguese or English, whilst the related jazz samba is an adaptation of street samba into jazz. The bossa nova style was pioneered by Brazilian João Gilberto and Antonio Carlos Jobim and was made popular by Elise Cardoso's recording of Chega de Saudade on the Chancao da Amor Demais. Brazilian percussionists such as Ayrton Moreira and Nana Vasconcelos also influenced jazz internationally by introducing Afro-Brazilian folkloric instruments and rhythms into a widely variety of jazz styles, thus attracting a great audience to them. Jazz fusion. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the hybrid form of jazz fusion was developed by combining jazz improvisation with rock rhythms, electric instruments, and the highly amplified stage sound of rock musicians such as Jimi Hendrix and Frank Zappa. Jazz fusion often uses mixed meters, odd time signatures, syncopation, complex chords, and harmonies. Miles Davis' New Directions. In 1969, Davis fully embraced the electric instrument approach to jazz in a silent way, which can be considered his first fusion album. Composed of two sidelong suites, edited heavily by producer Tio Mancero, this quiet, static album would be equally influential to the development of ambient music. Jazz rock. Although some jazz purists protested against the blend of jazz and rock, many jazz innovations crossed over from the contemporary hard bop sieve into fusion. As well as the electric instrument of rock, such as electric guitar, electric bass, electric piano, and synthesizer keyboards, fusion also used the powerful amplification, fuzz pedals, wah-wah pedals, and other effects that were used by 1970s era rock bands. According to jazz writer Stuart Nicholson, just as free jazz appeared on the verge of creating a whole new musical language in the 1960s, jazz rock briefly suggested the promise of doing the same. Traditionalists in 1980s. The 1980s saw something of a reaction against fusion and free jazz that had dominated the 1970s. Trumpeter Winston Marsalis emerged early in the decade and strove to create music within what he believed was a tradition, rejecting both fusion and free jazz and creating extensions of the small and large forms initially pioneered by artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, as well as the hard bop of the 1950s. It is debatable whether Marsalis' critical and commercial success was a cause of a symptom of reaction against fusion and free jazz and the resurgence of interest in the kind of jazz pioneered in the 1960s. Nonetheless, there were many other manifestations of a resurgence of traditionalism, even if fusion and free jazz were by no means abandoned and continued to develop and evolve.